Here to tell us what to expect on this burning planet for the next 4 years, writer Ashley Dawson posted the Verso Books blog post, Trump Eats the Planet. Welcome back to This Is Hell, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Good to be with you.
Ashley is professor of English at the City University of New York's Graduate Center and at the City University of New York's College of Staten Island. You may remember Ashley being on This Is Hell earlier this year to discuss his phenomenal book, Extinction, A Radical History. You start, Donald Trump is a fitting problem of the Capitalocene, the age when capitalism's relentless drive to expand has generated massive carbon emissions, pushing planetary ecosystems into states of unpredictable turbulence, precipitating a mass extinction crisis of unprecedented ferocity. So at least we know you won't be pulling your punches in your piece. For those who may not have heard you when you were on our show earlier this year, what is the mass extinction crisis that you see us facing, and how soon might that happen?
Well, we're living through it right now. Actually, since I last spoke to you, the World Resource Institute issued an update to their Living Planet Index that was about a month ago, where they talked about two-thirds of living species, that is, animals and plants, going extinct between the period 1950 and 2020. So we're in the middle of this mass extinction crisis, and human beings are largely responsible for that. Although, as I argue in my book on extinction, I think it's actually capitalism that's driving the mass extinction crisis rather than human beings in general.
But isn't it too late for the environment already to do anything about it? And if it is, how much worse can Trump really make the mass extinction crisis? Isn't that horse on fire and out of the barn a long time ago?
Well, no. I mean, this is a fight we all have to engage in our various different ways. I mean, just to take one specific example, actually, in Brazil, the rate of deforestation was really significantly diminished under Dilma Rousseff, the previous president, who was essentially deposed in a right-wing coup. And now the rate of habitat destruction in that really vital area of the planet is ticking up again. And that's one thing I really want to kind of highlight, is that Trump shouldn't be seen in isolation, that there's a whole sort of series of right-wing populist counter-revolutions going on around the planet, and that they all have a really worrying environmental aspect.
How much is Trump's anti-environmentalist policies, how much are those policies outliers of the Republican Party? Because I want to make sure that people understand I want to make sure that people understand if this is an aberration or if this is something systemic within the Republican Party.
No, I think it's really something systemic. In fact, if you look at all the appointees who he's been lining up in the week and a half or so since I wrote my blog post for Verso, they just are such industry hacks and longtime Republican tools that, he's really putting in place a whole branch of the Republican Party, which is ideologically committed to climate denial and to furthering the interests of fossil capitalism.
So why do you believe hopes in the market correcting for green energy, why do you believe those hopes are misguided? Why can't the market correct for consumer demand, assuming consumers demand being more green energy? And is the problem with the market not being able to correct itself because the consumers aren't demanding that green energy?
Yeah, that's a complicated point. Just actually a day or two ago, there was a piece in the New York Times sort of saying, that the market is driving things in the right way. And we kind of continue to see this perspective, and there are lots of important people with big voices, including former Vice President Al Gore, who talk in these kinds of terms. And there is some reality to that. Because of the boom in fracking, right? The country is really awash in gas and oil produced by fracking at the moment. And that surfeit of production is really responsible for making coal economically non-viable, right? So, it's definitely true that on a kind of economic basis, coal is not competitive at the moment. But What I try and do in the piece that I posted on the Verso site is to say, first of all, the kind of assumption that there's some inherent direction is that's market-led is misplaced, because we need to think about the market in global terms, right? I mean, it's a planet and a kind of planetary climate emergency that we're looking at. And if we think about what's happening on a planetary level rather than just within the United States, coal production is not diminishing at all. In fact, it's up really, really massively. And you can think about, for instance, countries like India, where there's a real kind of perceived need to drive industrialization by intense coal production. And of course, even the Chinese, now faced with a Trump administration, are sort of saying, oh, right, well, we're not going to keep going in a renewable direction, so we're going to amp up our coal production again. So the point is that these things are not exclusively economic, and that politics play a huge role in them. And while at the moment there's a kind of surfeit of liquid natural gas in the United States that makes coal non-competitive, and consequently you can find people saying current energy sources are not that intensive, right, in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. We've been shifting to less intensive forms of energy, and it's kind of objectively true that natural gas is less intensive than coal. Nonetheless, we have a lot of production of that. Methane is being produced, and on a global level, coal production is up massively. So, you just have to be very careful about this kind of narrative, which Al Gore and other ecological modernizers have, that the market is going to lead us in this wonderful direction, and that therefore we don't really need to worry about Trump. That the Trump and whatever his administration and all the flunkies of the big oil corporations like Scott Pruitt, who he's nominated to be EPA administrator. We don't really need to worry about what any of them do, because the underlying economic dynamics are driving us in this wonderful direction. And that needs to be challenged, and we need to be really clear about how we need to fight back politically.
Whenever I post something about climate change online, Ashley, you can count on somebody saying that the real problem is overpopulation. In your opinion, what do people miss in their understanding of the challenges that this planet faces when they think that the real problem is overpopulation, not climate change?
Oh, my goodness, overpopulation. Well, there have been currents, sort of Malthusian currents within the environmental movement in the past, but I think we really need to push back against that and see that, in fact, as part of precisely the kind of xenophobic, anti-immigrant, white supremacist, racist movements that Trump, unfortunately, has really brought to prominence in national discourse and politics today. It's about the distribution of resources rather than about any kind of specific amount of people, right? We live still on a planet that has many resources, and if we steward them and use them correctly, they could certainly support the number of people that we have. But if we allow capitalism, which is a system which is based on infinite expansion, to kind of run rampant, then we're going to end up in serious hot water. And that, of course, is precisely what the Trump administration is proposing to do. His pledges are all to take out every possible stop and allow fossil capitalism to develop as much as possible. So in my piece, I really argue that we have to keep fighting the kinds of fights that we saw unfolding in recent months at Standing Rock, and over the last week, actually. The victory there has been so wonderful and so positive. It may be rolled back in a few months once Trump comes to office, but nonetheless, I think it's really important politically and symbolically that people are standing up to fossil capitalism and fighting against the creation of this infrastructure. And speaking of something like Standing Rock, one of the things that Trump has talked about in his tweets and his platform is that this is going to be about energy independence and creating many jobs for Americans. Well, first of all, it's not going to create a huge number of jobs, right? We're not getting back kind of deep pit coal mines that are going to employ hundreds of thousands of people in West Virginia. The technology has moved on, and they're using mountaintop removal there, so it employs relatively few people. But the idea of energy independence, which Trump is touting as part of his kind of populist nationalism, is also a complete fiction. You know, a lot of the pipelines that are being constructed, including the Dakota Access Pipeline, are to ship natural gas and frack crude out of the country, right? Because we have too much production of that stuff here. So big corporations want to shift the stuff and transport it internationally, take it to places like Europe, where they can make 4 to 6 times as much money by selling it. So they're putting people in direct danger all over the place and doing it not in any way to support energy independence, as they call it, of this country. And one thing I've been thinking about just recently, I don't know if you've heard about this, Chuck, but there's this totally insane plan to build a pipeline right next to a nuclear power plant, one of the oldest nuclear power plants in the country, which is only 30 miles north of New York City. And they're going to put this pipeline within a couple of hundreds of feet of the nuclear power plant. And you couldn't think of a more insane plan if you tried. And that pipeline isn't to help people in New York City. It's to ship the gas up to Canada and then ship it off to Europe.
You know, I've been trying to figure out what explains climate change denialism. Do you think that Trump's climate change denialism allows him to give his supporters something other than bipartisan globalization to blame for their work and or their working and living conditions? How much do you think dismissing climate change alleviates any conversation or criticism of globalization, of continuing economic growth as a driving policy force?
I think that climate change denialism, I think Naomi Klein really hits it, nails it when she says that this is about having your pockets lined by the fossil fuel industry. The only thing I would add to that, as I say in my blog piece, it's not like Donald Trump is stupid or bad at science. He's getting paid very handsomely, and certainly if you look at people like Scott Pruitt, he has been deeply enmeshed in the fossil fuel industry. In 2014, a New York Times investigation, in fact, found that he was writing memorandums on letterhead that came directly from the fossil fuel industry. So they're basically just writing the legislation that he was trying to get passed in Oklahoma that was, pushing off attempts to regulate oil and gas. The only thing I would add to Naomi Klein's kind of analysis is just that a lot of that denialism, I think, picks up on the legacy of the Cold War, and resonates with these fears, which people sometimes have of entities like the United Nations coming in and taking over and robbing us of democracy. So, given the way in which democracy has been hollowed out in this country and taken over, and eviscerated, I can see why those kinds of fears are real and why these kinds of claims might resonate. But, of course, they're totally misplaced. And the people who are really gutting democracy are precisely the folks who Trump is bringing to Washington, right? He promised to drain the swamp of Washington. It's such an ironic metaphor because, of course, his policies are going to massively exacerbate climate change, including sea level rise. So he's actually bringing the swamp to D.C. in the most literal way, as well as, of course, metaphorically by bringing fossil fuel corporations and allowing them to take over the government, essentially.